26thly, they will be very easy in their accommodations where they find the poor man beginning to faint, and hearken to their overtures, wherein they will grant him his life, yielding to him as cunning anglers do with fishes. And to persuade him to complying, they will offer conference sometimes, or reasoning upon the point, to satisfy and inform his conscience as they pretend, but really to catch him with their busked hook. 27th, sometimes they used to stage several together, whereby they knew some would comply, to tantalize the rest with the sight of the other's liberty, and make them bite the more eagerly at their bait, to catch the conscience. But when they had done all they could, Christ had many witnesses, who did retain the crown of their testimony in the smallest points, till they obtained the crown of martyrdom, and attained boldly to them, without fear or shame, and disdaining their flattering proposals, but looking on them under a right notion, as stated there in opposition to Christ, whereby they found this advantage, that hence they were restrained from all sinful tampering with them, or entering any discourse with them, but what was suitable to speak to Christ's enemies, or doing anything to save their life, but what became Christ's witnesses, who loved not their lives unto death. Of whom universally this was observed, that to the administration of all, the conviction of many enemies, the confirmation of many friends, the establishment of the cause and the glory of their Redeemer, they went off the stage with so much of the Lord's countenance, so much assurance of pardon and eternal peace, so much hope for the Lord's returning to revive his work and plead his cause again in these lands, that never any suffered with more meekness, humility, and composure of spirit, with more faithfulness, steadfastness, and resolution, than these worthies did for these despised and reproached truths, for which their suffering brethren are now contending and suffering, while others are at ease. Part 3. The present testimony stated and vindicated in its principal heads. By what is above permitted, the reader may see the series and succession of the testimony of Christ's witnesses in Scotland from time to time in all the periods of that church, how it hath been transmitted from one generation to another down to our hands, how far it hath been extended, and what increasements it hath received in every period. How it hath been opposed by a continued prosecution of an hereditary war against Christ, by an atheistical, papistical, prelatical, and tyrannical faction, and how it hath been concerted, contended for, maintained, and sealed actively and passively by an anti-pagan, anti-popish, anti-prelatical, anti-Erastian, anti-sectarian, and anti-tyrannical remnant of the followers, professors, confessors, and martyrs of Christ in all ages. Now it remains in the third and last place to consider the merit of the cause as it is now stated, to see whether it will bear the weight of those great sufferings wherewith it hath been sealed. I hope all the lovers of Christ who have an esteem even for his reproaches, above all the treasures of Egypt, will grant that it is these sufferings, that if these sufferings, be stated on the least or lowest of the truths of Christ, then they are not mitiated, nor built upon a bottom that will not bear them, or is not of that worth to sustain them. For certainly every truth, the least of truths, is of greater value than anything we can suffer the loss of for it, yea, of infinitely greater value than the whole world. So that if I prove these heads of suffering to be truths wherein conscience is concerned, the cause will be sufficiently vindicated from the loadings and lashings of such as prefer peace to truth and ease to duty, who justify their own backwardness and detestable lukewarmness, call some of them only state questions about things civil, and not gospel truths and heads to state suffering upon. And if they be truths and duties, the cause will some way be rendered more illustrious than is stated upon the smallest hoofs and hairbreadths of the concerns of Christ's declarative glory, as being a greater witness of its owners' love and loyalty to Christ, and of their pure and tender zeal for his honor, than if for more substantial and fundamental truths, which a natural conscience may reclaim to decline, when, for the meanest circumstantials of Christ's truths, they declare and are ambitious to bestow their dearest blood. But if the complex of them be impartially considered, no unprejudiced arbiter will suffer himself to have such extenuating impressions of the present word of patience and testimony of the suffering remnant in Scotland this day, but it will appear to be a very weighty and worthy concern, as any that either men or Christians can be called to witness for, being the privilege of all mankind, the duty of all Christians, and the dignity of the churches to assert. It is for the glory and crown prerogatives and imperial regalia of the King of Kings, which reference to his visible kingdom, of which the government is laid upon his shoulders, against the heaven-daring usurpations and encroachments made thereupon, both as he is mediator and king, and head of the church, and as he is God and universal king of the world. As he is mediator, it is his peculiar prerogative to have a supremacy and sole sovereignty over his own kingdom, to institute his own government, to constitute his own laws, to ordain his own officers, to appoint his own ordinances, which he will have observed without alteration, addition, or diminution, until his second coming. This his prerogative hath been, and is invaded by Erastian prelacy, sacrilegious supremacy, and now by anti-Christian popery, which have overturned his government, inverted his laws, subverted his officers, and perverted his ordinances. As he is God and universal king, it is his incommunicable property and glory not only to have absolute and illimited power, but to invest his deputed ministers of justice with his authority and ordinance of magistracy, to be administered in subordination to him, to be regulated by his laws, and to be improved for his glory and the good of mankind. This glory of his, hath been invaded by tyrants and usurpers arrogating to themselves an absolute power, intruding themselves without his investment into authority, in a rebellion against him, in opposition to his laws, and abusing it to his dishonor and the destruction of mankind. Against both which encroachments the present testimony is stated, in a witness for religion and liberty, to both which these are destructive. This will appear to be the result and tendency of the testimony in all its parts, opposed by the enemies of religion and liberty, and the end of all their opposition, to bring it to this chronomenon: who shall be king, Jesus or Caesar? Let any seriously search into all their proclamations and edicts against religion and liberty. This will be found to be the sole and sense of them, practically and really speaking, to this purpose, especially since this man came to throne. J.R. quote, James the Seventh, second by the V of G, King of Scotland, England, France, and Ireland, defender of the anti-Christian faith, to all and sundry our good subjects, whom these presents do, or may concern, greeting. We have taken into our royal consideration the many and great inconveniences which have happened in that our ancient kingdom of Scotland, especially of late years, through the persuasions of the Christian religion, and the great hearts and animosities betwixt the professors thereof, and our good and faithful subjects, whose faith in religion is subject and subservient to our royal will, the supreme law and reason and public conscience, to the disappointment of our projects, restraint of our pleasures, and contempt of the royal power, converting true loyalty and absolute subjection into words and names, which we care not for, of religion and liberty, conscience and the word of God, thereby withdrawing some of the Christian faction from an absolute and implicit subjection to us and our will, as if there were a superior law to which they might appeal, and considering that these rebellious Christians do never cease to assert and maintain strange paradoxes. Such principles are as inconsistent with the glory and interest of our government as that the authority of kings should be hemmed in with limits, and that their acts and actions are to be examined by another rule than their own authority to make them lawful, that some things in the kingdom are not subject to the king's authority, that there is a kingdom within a kingdom not subordinate to the king, and that there is another king superior to the supreme, whom they will rather obey than us, that we must either take laws from him, or otherwise we are no magistrates, and, considering also their practices are conformed to their principles, they will not obey our laws, but the laws of another inconsistent with ours, and will calculate their religion according to his laws, and not according to ours, and continually make their addresses to and receive ambassadors from a prince whom we know not, whom our predecessors of truly worthy memory did crucify, one Jesus who was dead, whom they affirm to be alive, whose government they allege is supreme over all kings, whom they acknowledge, but as his vassals, being now by favorable fortune not only brought to the imperial crown of these kingdoms through the greatest difficulties, but preserved upon the throne of our royal ancestors, which from our greatest founder, Nimrod of glorious memory, and our illustrious predecessors Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Herod the Great, Nero, Caligula, etc., of blessed and pious memory, hath ever been opposite to, and projecting the destruction of that kingdom of Christ, do, after their laudable example, resolve to suppress that kingdom by all the means and might we can use, because his government is hateful to us, his yoke heavy, his sayings are hard, his laws are contrary to our lusts. Therefore we will not let this man reign over us. We will break his bonds, and cast away his cords from us, and advance and exercise our sovereign authority, prerogative, royal, and absolute power, which all our subjects are to obey without reserve. And as, by virtue of our supremacy, whereby we are above all, but such as we are pleased to subject ourselves to, settled by law, and lineally derived to us as an inherent right to the crown, we have power to order all matters of church as well as state, as we in our royal wisdom shall think fit, all laws and acts of Christ to the contrary notwithstanding, and accordingly in our royal wisdom have overturned the platform of that government which Christ hath instituted, raised all courts censed in his name, and severely interdicted all meetings of his subjects and entertainment of his ambassadors, many of whom, in contempt of him that sent them, we have punished according to law for negotiating his affairs in our kingdoms without our pleasure, and requiring allegiance and obedience to him, after we had exosperated them, after we had exosperated him. We have also established our right trusty and well-beloved clerks in ecclesiastic affairs, and their underlings by our authority to have the administration of the business of religion, and empowered our right trustly and well-beloved cousins and counselors to compel all to submit to them by finings, confinings, imprisonment, banishment, oaths, and bonds, and all legal means. So now, having prosecuted this war against Christ to this length, that we have no fears of a rally of his forces again so often beaten, we are now engaged with other anti-Christian princes to give our power to our Holy Father Antichrist, so far as may serve his purpose to oppose Christ in his way. But we reserve so much to ourselves as may encroach upon him in our capacity, and therefore we have thought fit to restore to Antichrist our ecclesiastical supremacy, from whom we borrowed it, and for which we have no use at present. But we resolve to maintain and prosecute our sovereign authority, prerogative, royal, and absolute power foresaid against Christ, and without subordination to him, from whom, as we fought none, so we receive no power by his warrant and grant, and against whom we mind to manage it to the uttermost of our power. Yet, reflecting upon the conduct of the 4 last reigns, how, after all the frequent and pressing endeavors that were used in each of them to reduce our kingdoms to Antichrist, the subjects of Christ were so stubborn that the success hath not answered the design, we must now change our methods a little, and tolerate that profession of Christ which we cannot yet get overturned, his subjects being so numerous, but always upon these terms, that they take a special care that nothing be preached or taught among them, which may be a testimony for Christ's prerogatives in opposition to our usurpation, or may anyway tend to alienate the hearts of our people from us, or our government, or preach his truths, which we have condemned as seditious and treasonable. Under the highest pains these crimes will import.